There are a great many kinds of spider mites, and many plants have some sort of spider mite associated with them or another. But if we're talking about the kinds of food crops we're growing around here, the spider mite we almost always are dealing with is one species, the two-spotted spider mite. This would be the spider mite you'd find on your beans in your garden or on your raspberries, or you're trying to grow some herbs and mites start to develop there. It's almost always two-spotted spider mite. It's a typical spider mite in terms of its development. All spider mites will develop in the same way through a sequence starting with an egg, which hatches into a very tiny larva, we call it, and then molts 2 more times to get to the adult. All can happen very quickly, with the life cycle being completed in a week or sometimes even less under optimal conditions. They do have males and females. The males are a little smaller, the end is a little more pointed. Females of the two-spotted spider mite usually have dark areas on the sides, although there are some others that have spots along the sides as well. And females will be laying in the order of 3, 4, maybe a half dozen, sometimes even more eggs per day. And the eggs that spider mites lay are quite large. You can see in this picture here, these are mostly adult females and the eggs that have been laid. So again, quite large eggs, and maybe 4, 5, 6 a day being laid under good conditions. So they do leave fairly good evidence that they have been there in the form of these eggshells, even if the mites themselves are no longer there. Furthermore, when they molt, and they again have to molt repeatedly, they're going to leave the old skins behind, such as aphids have to as well. And sometimes we can see those and determine if a plant has had spider mites, even if they're no longer there. So for instance, in the picture in the upper left is a fairly good picture of a lot of old cast skins that have been left behind during molting events. And in the leaf on the lower right, a little harder to see perhaps, but there's both active stages of spider mites, lots and lots of eggs, and lots of little white irregular objects that are the old cast skins that have been left behind during the course of molting. So they are fairly easy to diagnose, just small. The life cycle, as with any kind of insect and any kind of other arthropod, is going to be related to temperature, and some average development times at different temperatures are indicated in this slide. So for instance, if the average temperature was 65 degrees, it might take a little more than 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, but if it's 85 degrees, it's going to take 7 days. So obviously rate of development varies depending on temperature, with accelerated development at the higher temperatures. Now, how do spider mites get around? The two-spotted spider mite, like many spider mites, gets around over long distances by what's called ballooning, which is the same way that spiders also disperse long distance. Spider mites will collect along the tips of leaves or tops of twigs, someplace where they may catch the wind readily, maybe splay out a little bit of silk and get picked up by the wind and blown wherever they will ultimately go to, a process called ballooning. They do get through the winter in an adult stage. The two-spotted spider mite does. It doesn't produce overwintering eggs, but it does go dormant. And in this picture we happen to see, actually it's a different kind of mite, but we see an adult male and female in the upper left, and that's what they would look like in the summer. And then to get through winter, the females, the surviving overwintering stage, go into a dormant condition when they go into diapause. And also associated with this overwintering condition is color change. So when you see mites in a garden late in the season, often you'll start to see some that are a little more orange. And these are ones that are going to moved into overwintering shelter, where they will pass perhaps for months, and they will be a different color. They'll be a orange color, and will survive until the return of favorable conditions. So two-spotted spider mite overwinters as a a mature female, but she is in a dormant condition, and in that dormant condition can actually survive for the entire winter season, returning to activity in the spring. Usually finding some little crack or crevice. If it's outdoors, it might be around the base of the plants or under some leaf debris where they might overwinter. If it's on a tree, it might be in furrows of the bark, often near the base of the plant. So overwintered spider mites do have this color change, and then later will resume activity in spring and then revert to the normal color. In this picture here, the mites have not yet reverted to the normal color of the two-spotted spider mite. Now, the way that they feed, all spider mites, including the two-spotted spider mite, is by removing plant sap, but they do it in a different way than a thrips would do it, or certainly an aphid would do it. For one thing, their mouth parts are differently arranged. These are arachnids, they're not insects. The mouth part that they use for feeding is called a chelicera, and the chelicerae of spider mites have little whip-like structures on them that they use to flail away at the surface of the plant, break some of the interior cells, somewhat in the manner of a thrips, and then pick up the released fluid. And typically they will destroy 1 to 2 dozen cells whenever they settle, poking them, breaking them, releasing the cell contents, and sucking up the released fluids, move on. So wherever a spider mite feeds, you're going to see a small area that is light in color, a stippling type of injury. I think we've talked about this before. A little light area where the cell contents have been removed. And each feeding site will be a single little white stippling injury. And if you have a lot of spider mites and over time they're feeding, these will expand in area and will sometimes largely cover the surface. But each little spot is a single feeding event. In high populations, the stippling may largely cover the entire plant. The plant may start looking silvery or brown. Different plants respond differently to the way that they to the injury caused by spider mites. Different kinds of color change. Often there's some kind of light color, again, because the chlorophyll has been removed from the cells on which they fed, but sometimes you get kind of a bronzing is the reaction of the plant. And if you have enough, they can kill the leaf. And here we have a sweet corn field killed by another spider mite called the Banks grass mite, but achieved extremely high population in a very short period of time. And you can see the leaves are almost entirely killed. And this is in a fairly short cycle crop. Now, the two-spotted spider mite is a species that does produce webbing. It produces more webbing than many kinds of spider mites. You will see the webbing, however, only if you've got very high populations. Usually they produce webbing you would not notice. They'll use the webbing to cover them. It is protective in terms of preventing some of the predators that might try to attack them, or rainfall that might tend to wash them off. Often dust gets incorporated into the webbing and makes it even more difficult for spider mite predators or other things that may wish to attack them to get through. But again, visible webbing means you have a lot of mites. And they'll travel along the webbing. I'm not sure if you can see the little dots in the picture on the left, but those are little spider mites traveling the highways of webbing that have been produced on this greenhouse-grown pepper plant. So spider mites are fairly difficult to manage. We don't have a lot of options in many cases, but sometimes preventive practices can be very useful. So the things I want to talk about with spider mites would be monitoring them so you can detect them early, a little bit about biological controls. There's some cultural controls, some physical controls, and there are some products that can effectively control spider mites. Monitoring is very important, and the importance of this is to catch them early. Now, the most common kind of symptom you're going to see with spider mites is just little flecking at early stages. And this is a kind of symptom that is very useful for people to recognize. The plants just start looking a little off when the mites are even at pretty low populations. So that picture in the upper right shows fairly little injury on a nasturtium leaf in this case. And that's the kind of symptom that should be a flag. You can actively monitor for spider mites. It's done more often in outdoor settings on trees, but as indicated in the picture on the left, you can knock foliage off with a stick or some other tool over a piece of paper, and then look at what you've dislodged, and if you wait a couple of minutes, the spider mites will be moving all over the paper, so you can see how many you have. Again, each feeding state produces a small area of dead cells, and it progresses as you get more of these. And just getting an eye, just learning how to catch that kind of symptom is very important to make sure that spider mite don't get too far along before you see that something is happening, because it becomes much more difficult to control than when they're in very high population. And if you're ever wondering if you've had spider mites, they do leave those great symptoms behind. So they'll always have the cast skins on the leaf, almost always the underside of the leaf, the old shells from the eggs that they've left behind, that with a little bit of magnification are very easily seen. Now, there are a large number of natural enemies of spider mites that are active outdoors. The most common and important one in most settings is something called the minute pirate bug. And this is a very tiny true bug, and they feed on tiny things. So the minute pirate bugs are also the most important predator of thrips outdoors, but they'll also feed on aphids or spider mites. It is an insect that gets its name because it's black and white, like a pirate is got black and white, pirate flag is black and white, and very common but not so commonly observed predators that we'll see outdoors. Due to their small size, they're not often noticed. The nymphs, of course, do not have wings. They're not going to have the coloration of the adult. They kind of look like maybe perhaps a miniature aphid, but extremely active. They're predators. There's also a curious little group of lady beetles, the genus Stethurus, sometimes known as spider mite destroyers, that are specialists on spider mites. Tiny little beetles that are black, and the larva will be also a very tiny lady beetle that's strictly a spider mite predator. Thrips. We think of thrips as being pests, but there are some that are predators of other insects, and particularly predators of spider mites and other thrips. Usually the predatory thrips are banded in the adult form. So if you see one that is striped as indicated in pictures here, that's almost always going to be some kind of predatory species rather than a plant feeding species. There's also a very tiny fly. I can see this in the trade in terms of insects that can be purchased. I also see it in my own yard. It's called a mite predator gall midge. It is a tiny little fly larva that specializes in spider mites. It happens to be in a family of flies called the gall midges, most of which make strange growths on plants, but these ones feed on spider mites. There's also, by the way, a predator gall midge that feeds on aphids, and both of these may be found in an outdoor setting in Colorado. And then there's mites that eat mites. There's predatory mites. Often the most important predators of spider mites can be predatory mites, and many of these are also available commercially to control spider mites in indoor settings. Now, spider mite problems outdoors often have an association with environmental conditions. Not always, but often. And that's because both drought stress and low humidity can have effects that can increase the likelihood of having a spider mite problem. So in this picture, I think this is an interesting picture. It's my front yard. It's just outside my front door, and it's showing a morning glory that is growing in the left of the picture, growing right next to the side of my house, growing up a drain pipe, and to the right, it's growing on a trellis that's maybe about 6-8 feet away, that's holding up the porch roof. As you can see, there's very different appearance of the leaves in the ones that are growing next to the house compared to those that are growing a little bit away. And if you were to look at these leaves, they're covered with spider mites in the leaves that are next to the house, showing the symptoms. And you can almost find no spider mites on the ones that are 8 feet away. The difference is the site. Next to the house, it is getting a reflected heat. It's a south-facing wall. It's a drier spot. And both of those conditions are modified 8 feet away. They're getting a little more water. It's not as hot. You're not getting the reflected heat. So that sometimes can make a dramatic difference. And again, this is something I see every summer right outside my front door with this plant right here. And there are some reasons for this. So if we're talking just about drought and spider mites, there are a couple things that come into play. So the plant's not getting sufficient water. How does that make it more susceptible to spider mites? Well, one thing is sometimes they become nutritionally improved. There are cases where it's been demonstrated that there are changes in drought-stressed plants that make them better hosts. There's more free amino acids, and so the spider mites are being provided food, sap that is higher in nutrients, so their rate of reproduction can increase. The other, perhaps more straightforward reason that spider mites can increase on drought-stressed plants is just that the leaf is hotter. When plants go into drought stress, they're not going to open the stomates, they're not going to cool themselves as much, and it would not be unusual to get a degree or 2, maybe even 3 increase in temperature on a leaf surface if you had a drought-stressed plant. And since the rate of reproduction of spider mites can vary greatly depending on temperature, then outbreaks could be correlated to slightly higher leaf temperatures, among other reasons. So, for instance, here 75 degrees, 10-day life cycle in this case, 85, 7 days. Gets a little hotter. One case you're getting 3 generations or so a month. The other you're getting over 4. But the other aspect of siting that can affect spider mites is humidity. And this is something we have to deal with in the arid West, chronically, outdoors as well as indoors. And there are 2 things involved here. One is that spider mite feeding rate can also increase with lower humidity, so they may feed more rapidly, damaging more cells, in part because the ability of them to feed is related to how much how well they are able to get rid of excess water, which evaporates off. So much of what they're taking in is excess fluid, and lower humidities allow that to evaporate away. Low humidity, however, also can have a detrimental effect on the things that will affect spider mites that are predators. Now, the predators that we just discussed, all of them are tiny. A mite that feeds on another spider mite, a thrips, is a tiny insect. Minute pirate bugs are tiny, as the name would suggest. And with the small animal, they are usually more susceptible to low humidity because they've got a relatively small mass to their surface area, so they've got more areas to lose water from. And whereas a spider mite is small, it's taking in water constantly through its feeding. The predators can be adversely affected by low humidity. So let's look at 2 examples of predator mites that could be considered to be purchased and introduced in an indoor growing operation that had spider mites. The most commonly available one, and one that can do a good job under the right conditions, is Gallandromus occidentalis. But if you look at the environmental conditions that allow it to perform optimally, it takes high temperatures, which are usually common in this area, but it also requires humidities of over 50%. And that's the rub. We often don't have the high enough humidity to allow some of these predators to perform optimally. I mean, even one that is sold in the trade that is promoted as one that has low humidity requirements, Mesosiulus longipes, if you look at the provider's instructions in terms of care and how it operates, it says that this is a species that can only tolerate the very low humidity of 40% when the temperature is 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And the humidity will have to increase if you have a higher temperature situation. Now, even 40% relative humidity is sometimes difficult to achieve in this area. But again, where we site a plant and how we care for it, if we're using mulch or how we're watering the plant, can have a tremendous effect in terms of the humidity that's on the leaf surface, which is what we're trying to modify when we're talking about spider mites. Now, the other thing about moisture is that washing off plants can be something that should be considered in some situations for managing them. If you have a small number of plants, it is often not unfeasible to treat the problem by periodically taking them in, washing them off. Again, this will work if you can catch it early, if you get that eye for what spider mite look like, the injury looks like at early stage, and then somehow get it washed off. Maybe you have to take it into the kitchen sink. If it's a nice day, you take it outside, wash it down. But for small plantings, this should definitely be considered, and just keep on it and make sure you catch the symptoms early. Now, when we get into the issue of what kind of pesticides we can use on spider mites, it gets complicated, and that's because spider mites have fairly few pesticides that can effectively control them, at least that most of us can get a hold of, and there are a great many commonly used pesticides, insecticides, that actually, if you use them, will make the problem worse. Again, spider mites are not insects, so almost all insecticides do a very poor job to control mites. And in many cases, they can not only not control the mite, they can make it even worse. So sometimes we see mite problems being aggravated or flare in response to use of certain kinds of insecticides. In this silly picture here, it's showing a spider mite being exposed to the insecticide 7, permethrin, malathion. All of these are insecticides that, if used, will often cause spider mites to actually increase in number rather than be affected as we might hope. And the primary reason is that none of these are effective against spider mites, but they do adversely affect the predators. And if you're adversely affecting the predators, you're killing the predators, not killing the mite, your situation goes the wrong way. Now, there are, in actuality, at present, quite a few miticides on the market that are labeled to some degree for fruit and vegetable crops, and some of them are extremely effective for spider mites. However, this list, and this is not a complete list of spider mite products, is a list of products that are marketed for commercial use. Although some of them could be accessed, many of them cannot. They're not sold to garden for garden use, but they are sold for commercial use. So, I mean, that brings up what we have if you are just got a backyard garden or some houseplants. What do you do for spider mites? Unfortunately, we have very few options, and I would feel comfortable only recommending the horticultural oils. It could be neem oil, it could be cottonseed oil, it could be one of the petroleum oils, the mineral oils, but those work fairly well on spider mites. And again, if you're using them before the numbers get too far along, then these can work quite well. So quite a few options in terms of mite control if you are in commercial production. But if you are just growing a small number of plants yourself, or you're trying to grow them organically, you're pretty much left with the horticultural oils as the best current option if we're talking about a pesticide. So this pretty much covers the main kinds of things that we want to talk about with spider mites. Do watch the plants regularly. Make sure they don't get out of control. The spider mite populations get too far along. Both drought stress and humidity can greatly affect the rate of spider mite increase, and sometimes we can modify these conditions so that spider mites do not become as problem as they might otherwise. And if we are going to use pesticides, we have to be careful, again, because there's very few things that work well and quite a few things that will make the problem worse. So those are the primary principles for this fairly difficult kind of plant pest to manage.